Welcome, friends, wherever you are at this time. We are living in the days of radical upheavals in the USA, UK, and practically everywhere. Increasingly, it seems that good is called evil and evil good. Christians are either resigning themselves to passivity from any social political engagement, or they are vocally polarized, speaking and acting from the literally opposing and incompatible value platforms, often voicing a cognitive dissonance rather than seeking to follow Jesus consistently and with deliberation. At this time, this attitude is easily seen the ways we Christians relate to COVID-19 pandemic, to the questions of nationalism, racism, treatment of immigrants, refugees, homeless, minorities. Instead of bringing healing and sanity to our conversations and some reasonable solutions to social challenges, we Christians have contributed to growing social and political confusion. So we must ask, should we, followers of Jesus, speak truth to power at all in our post-truth days? For example, are we Christians supposed to join the protests against injustice, against racism? Should we Christians be actively involved in standing up for righteousness, for refugees, for immigrants, for example? Should we and how express our concerns through media, and especially through social media? Should we lift our voices against inhumanity, against injustice, against other social deviations at all? Or should we simply pray and be quiet, stay neutral, safe? Is it possible to stay neutral in the face of evil, we should also ask? Or should we be involved, act responsibly, and if we should, how? These are some of the questions our panelists will try to address today. With us in order of speaking are Camilla Bocaniala, the co-founder of Polylogos, a newly formed community bridge building association in Romania and social activist in peace building and reconciliation. Then Liviu Bocaniala, the co-founder and president of Polylogos Association and artist. And then with us today we have Heather Staff, an emerging UK politician, a political advisor on refugee, asylum and migration policy for a member of the UK Parliament, an executive member of a number of organizations. And then Hermund Haaland, co-founder and international director for Skaperkraft in Norway, and project initiator and co-manager of the production of the book, Is God a Populist? Then Edlira Cepani, human rights activist and community organizer in Albania. And then Zdravko Plantak, professor of ethical studies at Loma Linda University in California, the author of the book, The Silent Church. And I'm Tihomir Kukolja, the editor and the producer of Face-to-Face Conversation. Objective of our conversation today is to open up an ongoing conversation on the relevant theme on how to speak the truth to power and to each other in our post-truth era from a Christian perspective. A warm welcome to all of you. And now a disclaimer is due. All views expressed today are the views of the panelists involved and not necessarily of the organizations they are associated with. And now finally, let us start. And let us start with Camilla Bocaniala. How does the challenge of speaking truth to power and to each other look like from a perspective of a young human rights activist and co-founder of Polylogos Association, an organization that focuses on investing into the lives of young leaders? Welcome, Camilla.
Thank you, Tihomir. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this topic. Because it's relevant for the conversation, I would like to start by sharing a little bit about what we're doing in Romania. So looking around us and seeing the lack of good leadership on one side and the lack of healthy political engagement on the other side, we decided to create an organization, which we call Polylogos, by extension from Greek, meaning multiple points of view. So I want to give you first some brief context into the situation we're in. In Romania, electoral turnout among youth, especially in parliamentary election, is very low. At the same time, it's youth who are dominating protests and petitions in the country. And one explanation for this is the pervasive lack of trust that people have towards democratic institutions and political leaders in this country. According to a study, a publication from the Center for the Study of Democracy in Cluj, over the past decade, public trust has never gone over 15%, and it sometimes drops as low as 6%. This study is from 2017. To respond to this challenge, we provide a platform for dialogue, networking, capacity building, and other constructive engagement in society. It's firmly pro-democracy and pro-human rights. It's not a religious or political organization because we want to provide a space that is neutral for constructive, enlightening, and respectful dialogue, maybe particularly around difficult and sensitive topics. And it's very important for us to keep this space neutral in order to better facilitate such conversations, because the people who would take part represent often very different and many times opposing opinions and worldview. So we believe that dialogue and good leadership is so important, especially now in this time. I graduated from university with a master in peace and conflict reconciliation. Historically, one of the things we often get wrong is that we wait until a conflict has turned violent before we start our interventions. In peace work, just like in medicine, there is such a thing as preventive measures. If a patient is at high risk of diabetes, his doctor will tell him to eat healthy and exercise as a way to prevent developing an illness. And in the same way, if a country is experiencing conflict at different levels, and where there is people, there is always conflict, non-violent means of addressing these need to be provided in order to prevent a violent outbreak. And democracy in itself is such a measure. It's flawed, but it's malleable, and it's the best method that we have. So Polylogos being politically and religiously neutral does not mean it's neutral in regards to truth, which is the topic of this conversation. In fact, one of our core values at Polylogos is integrity, of which truth is an essential part. We have a responsibility, I would say even an obligation, to uphold and seek truth in all things. And this was always the case, but especially now, in a time where misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories seem to be spreading like wildfire. And these elements are dangerous because with so many different and opposing narratives running around, it's becoming near impossible for people to filter out the truth from all the rest. And when we don't know what's true, we become extremely vulnerable to manipulation. And some argue that there is no truth. As you indicate with the title for this conversation, Tiomir, we live in a post-truth era. People might wonder why the loss of truth is considered dangerous, and many seem to think that this is simply being progressive and open-minded. In our culture, everything is relative, and to speak in absolutes means you must be either a fundamentalist or you're uneducated. And people will say, live your truth, speak your truth, but don't impose it on me. That's the mindset of our days. And this is a challenge for us as Christians. We cannot conform to this thinking because essentially we do believe in one single absolute truth, the truth of Jesus. And if we start watering this down to conform to a culture of relativism, we're in danger of watering down the very core of ourselves. Even if we take our faith out of the equation, embracing the lack of absolute truth creates a dangerous precedent in our society. If there's no truth, there's no credibility. And when there's no credibility, there's no trust. And the lack of trust will erode our conversations, our relationships, our democracies, and essentially our peaceful coexistence. So while many Christians might not think much about democracy, aspiring for peace is something that I think we can all agree on. In Matthew 5:9, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who make peace, for they will be called children of God." A vast majority of conflicts in the world today are resolved through democratic means and methods. I would argue that if we are called to make peace, shouldn't we then also care about democracy? For many years, I've been wondering why Christians often seem to think that politics doesn't have anything to do with them, or that they shouldn't have anything to do with politics. And if they do, it's only on certain topics identified as important by the church, such as abortion or same-sex marriage. And it seems to always be from the position of being against someone or something. I had to dig into the Bible a little bit to see if I was wrong about this, or if we actually do have a bigger role to play in politics. And the Bible talks a lot about social justice and responsibility. It calls us to care for the orphans or the fatherless, the widows, the foreigner, being the immigrants, the refugees. The poor can be poor in health, poor in money, poor in hope, the oppressed. However, the Bible doesn't just stop at telling us to care for these people. It also refers to bringing justice, to pleading their cause, to delivering the oppressed from the oppressor, and generally doing what is good, just, and right. And what many believers seem to forget is that the scripture explicitly asks us to open our mouths, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the poor and needy, from Proverbs 31:9. Instead, we seem to shut our mouths, judge hypocritically, and shout loudly for our own rights. I see three main responses to the challenge of political engagement in churches today. Political apathy, with withdrawal and distrust and lack of engagement. Consensus-driven Christianity, which would be presenting a carefully diluted gospel that will not offend anyone. And Christian nationalism, a new term that we've been hearing a lot in media recently, putting national identity and traditional white evangelical culture ahead of core biblical truth. As none of these responses seem to be rooted in scripture, my question is, how did we get here, and how can we do better? And maybe one way to start is by having conversations like this one. I would like to end my opening with a quote from Billy Graham, the theologian. "Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are often stiffened."
Thank you, Camilla, very much. You have really given us a beautiful opening and lots of to think about and talk about in a minute or two. Now I'd like us to go to Liviu. Liviu is one of the co-founders of Polylogos and the executive director of Polylogos, and also an artist. We who know Liviu, we know that he's a great artist. Liviu, what would you like to share on this topic?
Thank you, Tihomir. Such a great honor to be with all of you, friends. I'll just dig in. Obviously, my first thoughts upon reading about a nice subject took me to one of my obsessions, that is C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. C.S. Lewis intended The Great Divorce in part to be a disproof to a famous poem by the English author William Blake, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Essentially, Blake used his poem to argue that hell gets a bad rap, while Christian theology claims that hell is wicked and should be avoided at all costs. Blake proposed that hell and evil in general was a vital component of creativity, enlightenment, and happiness. In all, Blake suggested that the only way for humans to be truly enlightened was to marry heaven and hell in their lives. In other words, to be kind and lawful, heavenly, but also proud and devious, hellish. Blake further suggested that a life lived according to traditional Christian values would be boring and repetitive and even overly prudish, and even implied that God and Satan were allies. C.S. Lewis despises this theory and tries to refute Blake's argument, divorcing heaven and hell for good. And it is this divorce that dichotomizes the very core of one's being them followers of Jesus of Nazareth, opponents of his path, or otherwise agnostics. So following that argument, when we're faced, for example, with the task of sharing the truth, what would Jesus do? That task will always be counteracted in one's mind and soul by a set of socioeconomic status stereotypes. What would people think? And this is valid in spite of the protection of a computer or a phone screen, also for the dynamic one has with social media. One of the problems is that when we hear social media, most people will immediately think of Facebook or Instagram or even Twitter, since a certain president started abusing it. We do not immediately consider that YouTube or LinkedIn or Viber and WhatsApp or Snapchat or Pinterest or blogging on different matters also fall under social media categories. And how about anomalies, like I call them, like TikTok? Not to mention those very specialized, restricted to different world areas like China or Korea or Russia. I personally believe we must choose our battles with extra wisdom. We should not be content with only sharing our views or opinions, but also start asking ourselves, is this communication of mine really efficient? To whom am I sharing my thoughts and why? If I strongly believe I have the truth or a valuable part of the truth, I should probably start asking myself whether or not I am sharing my pearls with pigs. Don't give to dogs what is holy, and don't throw your pearls to the pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, then turn and attack you. We find this quote in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 7, verse 6, according to Complete Jewish Bible Translation. And we are all way too familiar with the hate speech in the comments people allow themselves to add to some posts. Somebody, as we know, will always turn and attack you. And those are called pigs in the Bible. So to summarize, a few questions. Do I really know the truth and not my truth? Then is it my job or calling or ministry or career, whatever you may call it, to spread this truth or the truth? With whom am I sharing the truth? Which leads us to a very important ethical issue. Am I sharing my truth or the truth? Is there one truth or are there more truths? Are we merely channels allowing the truth to flow and basically distribute itself? Or are we creators of truths that distribute only what our own worldview filters allow to pass through? And that is what I would call valuable parts of the truth. The problem I see with the latter is that it is too easy to recreate a brand new image from the pieces of an original paint. And as faithful subjects of this postmodernist era, we are all inclined to be recreators in music and visual arts, in industry, in medicine. Again, the problem could be that something which only has pieces of truth in it could be against the very truth itself. The fact that we put together pieces of truth and it becomes my truth opens the trail for endless debates about what is good and what is evil. If I'm a channel, I will always follow the source. That is what allows one to call him or herself a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. Somebody could affirm, okay, if you are only a channel, you are a robot, you are manipulated, you have no brains to think for yourself. The way I see it is that even as channels, we are not equal in flavor or color. So we are allowed to transport the truth the way a good expensive drink like wine, if you may, is transported or stored in special barrels, which impart their taste according to so many preferences. The diluted pure truth reaching the recipients according to their own level of understanding. As a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, I know and I believe that truth is the person of Jesus, what he did and what he thought. Now the question remains, do we want to know the mind and the heart of Jesus, or do we prefer to manipulate his teaching and his example to fit into our limited window of perception? I will dare to say, Tihomir, we do not live in a post-truth era, but in a more dangerous neo-truth era, basically a neo-Jesus era. We feel attacked and embarrassed and outraged and disturbed. So we rejected, or at the best diluted, Jesus, the truth, plus something else. We cannot embrace the fact that it is the great divorce that saves us. This is my argument as a basis for our discussion tonight, and thank you, Tihomir.
Thank you, Liviu. Thank you, Liviu. You are really making me think, because I personally find it challenging today. How does one communicate the truth as it is on the platform, on the person of Jesus? Especially in the age, I don't know whether this is in Europe the same, but here in the USA, where you have different groups of people who all of them claim that what they are doing is nothing else, but actually they're standing on the platform of the person of Jesus. And actually this cannot be so, because the fruit of what they are doing, of their lives, demonstrates something completely opposite. So we can't all be really on the platform of Jesus. Some are really lying, while the others are standing and working from the platform of Jesus. Maybe we will have more time to say more about this, but now we are going to go to Heather, to UK. Heather, you are a politician. I know you have had lots of experience, lots of oppositions, lots of challenges. So please share.
Yeah, thanks to Tihomir for inviting me to this. I should just put a disclaimer as well. I'm not an elected politician, but have worked for a couple of them, so not yet anyway. So in my role, particularly for the opposition in the UK, so I work with a parliamentarian that does a lot on immigration, so migration, and has now just been promoted to Secretary for State for Education. So it's a difficult position to be in sometimes, because you have to find your voice in a very nuanced way, and particularly being a Christian within a political system, as it were, with friends on the opposition as well. And I want to start actually with a few phrases that have been bandied around a little bit, and you often see them on Twitter, and they tend to go like this: and people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. And that is a very worthy statement, but also it can be posed sometimes to say you're not supposed to say anything at all, because all of us have problems, all of us at times are hypocritical in what we're saying, but does that mean I should never make a judgment about something as well? And the other statement sometimes we hear is, sometimes, well, we should just pray for that. I don't mind you praying for this situation, but you need to separate yourself out from your worship of Jesus and your political role. That's often banded out as well. Or just pray for it, but please don't talk about systemic injustice. Don't talk about economic inequality. Don't talk about racial systemic inequality, because that's too difficult. That's not what we should be really focusing on, and certainly not you as a believer in the political system. And that's very difficult, because for me, my faith and my work are very much entwined. I don't think I would be in the role I was in if it were not for my faith, and that brings me a situation where I feel I care very deeply for the people that I want to be a voice for, and I have the pleasure of advising a senior politician on as well. The other problem we have sometimes is the timing of when we speak out, and that's a question I often ask myself as well. You know, when should we be vocal on Twitter or Facebook? And we've had many conversations about that already today, and that can be really difficult, particularly when you're in a position where you're not supposed to necessarily be the person talking, and you have to be very nuanced in that discussion. I want to relate that actually to something that's not political, and that's in my role. Often I play bass guitar in my worship team, and being a musician, you know a lot about timing and you know a lot about tempo. So if I were to come in and play on every song loudly, it wouldn't necessarily do anything for the song. It might be the wrong rhythm, it might be the wrong key, it might make a lot of noise, but it won't necessarily say anything useful to the song. It might be a distraction. If I don't play anything at all, then what am I there for? I'm just on a stage surrounded by great musicians doing nothing. So the timing, the tempo, the rhythm, and the nuance of each note is really important. And I think that is something I carry with me into politics as well. And I feel like we have lost that ability at times to be both believers and in the political spectrum at knowing when is the moment for action, when is the moment for nuanced conversation, and when is the moment to just pray and reflect or to step back. And through what we've seen lately, whether that's the Black Lives Movement and what's been going on there, or whether it's with refugees and asylum seekers, coming in at the right moment is so vital. Otherwise you just make a mess of things, or you don't do anything and people call you impotent, and it is really difficult. When you speak out, you will always put yourself at risk. I remember my father once saying to me, you know, please don't get involved in party politics, because when you're up front, you will get shouted at, essentially. Everybody hates you. We've heard that as well, and it's true. They do. Everybody hates you. You have to grow thick skins, but you also have to hold at the heart a sense of what is right. If I don't call anything out, if I don't ever call something to be accountable, then what really am I doing? Am I bringing a change in culture? As someone once said to me, it was a sermon we had on a Sunday, and they said, if the church is never speaking out about culture around us, then what is the church for? If we're not shouting about inequality, if we're not talking about subjects like women's rights, or if we're not speaking out on behalf of the voiceless, those who are the most vulnerable, what are we for? Who are we pointing people to? Are we just another TED Talk? Are we missing the nuance of the kingdom, of the gospel, at the centrality of all we do? And that really sticks with me every time I try and do anything politically. It's also dangerous. We've heard things about nationalism and faith, or putting things out there and people saying you shouldn't be speaking. But again, there's nothing wrong with critical thinking. In fact, my whole job, actually, particularly now with my boss being promoted, as it were, is to be devil's advocate. It's to come up with critical thinking. It's to say, okay, you're amazing, but what about this, this, and this? Occasionally, I may even say that the opposition have a good policy, or I may be really critical about it, and I would expect the same to me. I would expect our policies to be critiqued and costed, and for people to say where we get it wrong. And likewise, that is my duty as a Christian working in politics, is to critique and to hold to account. And if we lose that, what are we? Are we in fact post-democratic? Are we post-truth, as has been talked about as well? And then there's the other thought, and that is, we can speak about truth without integrity. You can say something that is true and not necessarily believe it. You can say it because it's a good media headline. You can say it because it's going to win you friends on Twitter. You can say it because it fits you into the right space or the right bubble. But if there's no integrity behind it, then what actually are you living for, and what actually are you speaking out about? Are you going to actually cause a lot more mess than perhaps for just not saying anything at all? I work in the migration space primarily and on refugees, and that can get incredibly toxic. The other weekend, there was a problem where a person was, he stabbed somebody who turned out to be someone with real mental health issues, who was also here on a resettlement program. Sunday, we had another experience of that, where some people who had been housed had mental health problems and weren't properly looked after, and then ended up stabbing fellow asylum seekers. Before the news had even broken, people had made up their mind about that situation. Judgment had been cast, glass houses had been broken, stones had been thrown, and they were all demonized. We shouldn't be housing asylum seekers. They are illegal. They are invaders. Look, we told you this would happen. Nothing about mental health. Whereas we see attackers who have been white before, and the first question is, oh, they must have had a bad upbringing. Or, oh, maybe they had a mental health problem. So much grace shown to those of our own privilege and background. But what about those different to us? What about those that make us feel complex or awkward? And that's the question. When the media headline is invader, how do I respond to that without feeling a sense of real anger, but also not losing my own personal integrity in that? We've also seen headlines around BAME communities and COVID-19. There was a report that was leaked and then published that showed the majority of doctors in this country who have died from COVID are BAME, and that's Black and ethnic minorities. The people who are on intensive care are ethnic minorities. And the report said itself, this is most likely the result of racial injustice. Why is that? Why are BAME communities the first people to suffer? Why are they the people in housing estates that burn down without any assistance? Is it wrong to call that out? And that's the question. And it shouldn't even be a party political question. So often you hear that put into a box of left or right. If I speak out about economic or racial inequality, am I a lefty liberal? Or let's put it more rudely, I'm a communist. If I speak out about economic wealth or prosperity, am I always on the right? Am I a conservative? No. There is somewhere in the middle. I should care about all. And in fact, James in his book tells us we should show no favoritism, no partiality. We should be caring about the whole. Everybody is born and made in the image of God. And that's that, really. I think we start and end with that. Everybody is born and made in the image of God, and that is what should really drive us when we are putting things out on Twitter or in the media and trying to hold to account. Justin Welby, in his book Reimagining Britain, wrote a chapter on asylum and refugees, and one of his main purposes in that was to basically say we've got to watch our language. He said we must resist and turn back the worrying trends we are seeing around the world towards seeing the movement of desperate people as more of a threat to identity and security than an opportunity to do our duty. He goes on to say refugees, like all people, are treasured human beings made in the image of God who deserve safety, freedom, and the opportunity to flourish. Jesus commands us to care for the most vulnerable amongst us. And really, that's where I want to leave this and say, if we are not caring for the most vulnerable amongst us, if we are not being nuanced in our conversations, watching our words, if we're not holding one another to account, iron sharpening iron, then what are we doing and what are we here for?
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Beautiful. You are making me think. I'm thinking about a couple of things at this moment, at least. One is how tragically it seems that every possible thing is being politicized today. Whether you stand for immigrants, whether you stand for refugees, whether you stand against racism, everything, even the thing which is a healthy issue, and this is this current pandemics, everything is being so much politicized that the moment you speak, say something, there are others who are putting you in one or the other box. And yet the values and the truth are not political matters. They existed before any politics as we know it existed today. So thank you for that. And now we go to Hermund from Oslo. So Hermund, you are one of the leaders of the Skaperkraft, and I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit more about this too, but also you have been very actively involved in the production of the book, which is called Is God a Populist? And I do not doubt, here it is, that you have something to say to us too. Please speak.
Thank you, Timur, and it's such a privilege to be with you, everyone, and to discuss this prudent topic. And actually, wrapping up in a few words why we started Skaperkraft, it was 10 years ago that we thought we needed more moderate voices representing the majority of Christians in Norway in the public square, because even 10 years ago, the media ran after those most outspoken, most to the right or most to the left, with the most tabloid versions of presenting their faith in the public square. So that's been one of our tasks, to bring to the table a broad and variety way of expressing the values we find in the Bible, and to do this in a way that communicates well with the public at large. And in those 10 years, we've been able to at least reach some success in becoming one of the 4 most visible think tanks in Norway, and touching on a variety of issues such as, yes, faith and the role of faith in the public debate, but also on human trafficking and entrepreneurship, and how do we create a new economy after the oil, which we are depending on in Norway, and a variety of issues to show that Christians actually engage in a number of issues with making alliances with all good forces, working for the common good, not just for the rights of believers. So that was the background, and we're now about 4 or 5 people working full-time in Skaperkraft, and it's been intense, but also lots of fun. So I'm thankful to be able to share a few thoughts, and I'll start going back to my childhood, because when I grew up in the 80s, we all watched the same one TV channel in Norway. We were probably behind America in that respect, and the UK and other countries. But I remember then as a 12-year-old, for example, we could discuss on Tuesday in school the Monday night movie. Everyone had seen it, most of us in class. So it was easier to hold on to the same view of reality when we all had the same source. Obviously, as the media has morphed into a myriad of echo chambers, and that perhaps is most vividly seen in the US in the last decade, the media world has become so extremely polarized, and truth is no longer easy to find, which we have heard so far in the discussion, in the introductions. So if we're going to try to see how we got here, we would need to consider layers and layers of reasons. And if we dig deep enough, as also has been mentioned, we would probably hit on the philosophical foundation of postmodern ideology, where the general view is that there is no real truth. All that matters is our different perspectives and experiences. And this has indeed affected the church. On a little side note, the Swedish theologian Magnus Malm says, "We live as if God is dead." So the twin brother of postmodernism would probably be secularism. We have become so secular that we live as if God is dead in the church. So obviously then, it's been a while since we had, as a church, one true definition of reality and truth in every area of social life. But never in time in history has there been so many perspectives of truth being conveyed as truth. So it's really hard to navigate for young people, especially in this day and age. But I would propose that the church in many ways then, in essence, has lost the love of truth and the concept of truth itself. I've been inspired by the speaker and author, an expert of change management, Peter Senge. He himself is openly inspired by New Age thinking, but his observation towards the church is interesting. It's expressed in the book, The Fifth Discipline, and referring to Jesus, who says in John 8:32 that we should know the truth and the truth shall set us free. He says, Peter Senge says, that the Christians historically had a strong understanding about truth and facing the truth as a mean to change behavior. He thinks we've actually lost this concept of truth and the power of change that comes with facing reality and truth. Instead, knowing truth was altered from facing reality as it is to embracing the belief in a savior. So as long as you believe in Jesus, then you're fine, then you're in truth. You don't have to face truth as a concept or the reality around you anymore. I'm no expert of the history of the American culture wars, but James Davidson Hunter, who wrote in the book To Change the World, The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World, it was 10 years ago approximately, he wrote this book. He believes American Christians, both on the left and on the right, have politicized faith, which you've pointed out so many times, Tiamir. And this has been happening to the extent that faith is too much connected with just that of few political issues. If you win these issues, and we've touched on them, abortion and family rights, then society becomes re-Christianized, especially goes the thinking on the Christian right. We see this tendency in Europe as well, maybe as not as clearly. And as God a Populist, we point to how populist movements are coupling nationalism with the Christian heritage in their nation states, Hungary and Poland being very obvious examples. Now, research from both Germany and the UK shows that active churchgoers actually vote populist parties to a less extent than the average citizen. So one could say that the active Christians in Europe do not bite this populist tendency as strongly as perhaps our brothers and sisters in the States right now. But in any case, I would say that the growth of populist parties using the Christian lingo to spread their message actually undermines the very democracies Christian thinking through the ages have played a real and strong part in establishing. One that would point this out is historian Tom Haaland in his book Dominion, which has been a bestseller lately. He has shown that Christianity has played a big part in shaping Europe. Now, this heritage is being used by populists, in my opinion. Now, if we get to the practicalities, what could our response be if we want to be citizens of both the world, our nations, and believers? What could a Christian response look like? I would propose 3 ways. 1, to resurrect the meaning of truth and thus become a constructive force with other good forces for the common good and for the safekeeping of democracy. So we must, again, fight for the common standards of reality. If we look at the example from Peter Senge and John 8:32, Jesus equals truth. That means, in my opinion, if we endeavor to follow Jesus, then it's the truth, but also everything else which is true is in essence on God's side. God is for seeing reality as it is. To know the truth, yes, in the deepest sense, is to know Jesus. But Jesus is truth, and knowing him means we have to face reality. We have to be true about what is. Senge uses this in change management. In order to see change in a personal life, in an organization, or in society, we have to face reality as it is. This will set us free. If you face the fact that you are drinking too much, you realize you're an alcoholic, that is the start of a process that could lead to you being free of alcohol misuse. This used to be obvious, but now we have to say we have to face reality. COVID-19 the coronavirus is real. In order to deal with it, we have to believe, one, it's real. Two, we have to keep social distance. We have to stay healthy. That will lead to our freedom from it. We can stay healthy. So we need to address fake news, I believe. So how do we do it? Well, we could also, on the second point, try to be bridge builders. I think we have a special role to play to help bridge the communication between polarized groups, especially within the body of Christ. It's hard. Even in Norway, which is a pretty homogeneous country, we see polarized conversation. It's really hard to communicate with believers who are populistic. But as Luke Brotherton, professor of theology at Duke University in the United States, shares in his chapter, he says we have to try to understand the populists and to understand why did it evolve. What are the causes that would lead to people voting on populist parties? And even sometimes we would be able to side with populists. He would say that Martin Luther King was an example of leading a populist movement. Sometimes populism isn't bad. This isn't black and white. So understanding and trying to understand what are the underlying issues that are leading to people voting as they do, for example. And thirdly, I believe as believers, we need to engage in politics, but not to politicize faith. We need to follow the example of God as we find it in Genesis chapter 1, the creator God who creates and makes things better and improves. So that means following his example, we need to try to solve the problems of our day and thus be salt and light. Recently, I read Michelle Vucker's book called The Gray Rhinos. She says there are a number of issues that we actually know and see coming in the near horizon, such as pandemics, the growing inequalities between rich and poor, the chronic unemployment among young people around the world, and the climate crisis is an obvious example. We need to face these because they are so much more reasonable to face early on rather than to wait when the gray rhino actually comes in your face. So that leads to three ways that we could engage as Christians: work for a resurrection of the meaning of truth, be bridge builders, engage in politics, and not just for our own group, but for the sake of everyone's good and trying to solve the issues that we see coming towards us. I will end with one quote. At the end of the day, we may need a crisis to be stronger before positive change can come. This perspective was brought to my attention in a recent Theos think tank podcast by former Member of Parliament in the UK, Alistair Burt. He thought polarization will get worse in politics, also between Christians, before we can find a new, meaningful way in society to go forward. I choose to share his optimism, but he might also be right that we actually have to see things grow worse before the light is again visible at the end of the tunnel. I think I will end with those thoughts and look forward to further conversations.
Thank you, Hermund, and I'm too looking forward to further conversation. And we are now going to Albania. And Edlira, I would now like to ask you to share your perspective. I know that you are a very active human rights activist, not only through social media, but actually there on the streets. And you are something of what I would like to call like a community organizer too, and much more than this. Please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Tihomir, and thank you for inviting me in this very interesting and valuable panel. And most of all, thank you for discussing this issue, which for me has been a very interesting debate through the years. As you were saying, I am a human rights activist. At present, I lead an organization of women in politics, which was a challenge itself when it was created 10 years ago, because it's composed of 50% women from the left-wing parties and 50% women from the right-wing parties. So 10 years ago, when we created the organization, nobody believed it would resist neither one month, not even 10 and 11 years now. So with this challenge in our minds and in our hearts, we have been struggling to raise the voice of women and girls in Albania, and to work together for a better country, not only for women and girls, but also for the community. What I believe in is Christian. Is a Christianity that I would call an active Christianity. We live in a world that is full of problems. Unfortunately, you have seen me many times active in protests in the fields, because the problems are a lot, unfortunately. And what I believe is that Christians should not be closed in their church walls, but they should be on the field, fighting for what they think is important, and fighting in the model of one leader that we always use in our leadership academy as the model of successful leadership, and that one is Jesus. If we try to see the leadership model of Jesus, we would see some characteristics. One, Jesus was in direct contact with people. He was not staying at home or in the office closed, and he wasn't just praying. He was there on the field, knowing the reality, speaking to people, and helping the real people, and understanding what the reality is and what the people really need. When he knew the needs, he was experiencing the servant leadership. He knew the needs of the community, and he was there to help them as much as he could. We had a very powerful earthquake in Albania some months ago, and what we saw is that people showed a wonderful solidarity with each other. And what we saw is that Christians, Muslims, non-believers, they work together on the field to help people in need, and to help those who were touched by the earthquake. And this was, as in Albania, we have this very good example of religious tolerance and religious cooperation. This was one of the best examples of how we should be working on the field with our communities. On the other hand, what did Jesus do as a leadership model that we as Christians have? He didn't just pray for the problems of the world. He raised his voice against injustice. One of the most typical reactions was Jesus in the temple, when he thought that the injustice that was taking part at that moment had to be told. So what we believe in is a model of leadership with values, and in the struggles that we have nowadays between values and anti-values, we as Christians need to take a stand, because this struggle is very important at the moment, and people need us to take a stand. We are called in the Bible light of the world, and we are not light of the world just as a symbolic expression. We should be the light of the world because we need to shine so the world sees which is the right path to the real truth. So the question, should we just pray or should we do really something, is a big debate that I have with my friends when they see me in the field or when they see me protesting many times. I think that we have a very interesting expression that is, in the end of a problematic, what people will remember is not the word of their enemies, is the silence of their friends. So shall we as Christians be silent as we see injustice and just try to manage it in a silent way? Or shall we do something, say the truth, and do something on our own? As Heather was saying, people might ask themselves, where are the Christians? And this is a question that they shouldn't ask. They should see us and we should be present and involved properly. And how would be a proper involvement of Christians in the issues of today's world, in the problematics and what we face in every day? We should be there being constructive, and it is possible. We should have no prejudice. Sometimes we have this prejudice of judging people from far and not entering the real situation. With no hate speech, with respect. These are all values that we bear as a Christian, and it's not difficult for us to bear them in an issue and in a problematic. As I was saying, one of our activities is the Leadership Academy of young people in politics, of women in politics. We do it with different range of ages and of group interests. We always speak about leadership models with integrity. And this kind of leadership is very unknown nowadays. If you ask, especially young people, tell me a name of a leader, they will tell you the name of a politician. Then you say, tell me the name of a leader with integrity. They wouldn't know. And they wouldn't trust and they wouldn't believe in a model of leadership with integrity. And what we do is help them understand that leaders with integrity are the leaders that we need today. And yes, it is possible. And we give them examples of Christian politicians, believers, and people that, yes, they have made it through and they have led with integrity. So I think this is a testimony that we should live with our lives. Sometimes they even ask me, how can you live not being corrupted in Albania or even in the world? And I say, yes, it is possible. It is possible not being corrupted, having integrity, and fighting for values. Even if it's the most difficult way, it is possible, because Jesus has shown the way on how it is possible. And the message that we give usually is a message of love. And I would say that love, in my opinion, is equal to truth. And we are here to love and also to tell the truth. And the truth is, we need models of leadership with integrity that are modest, but that are loud, because this world needs us now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Edlira. Thank you, Edlira. You emphasize a number of things, one of which is the question of integrity. And tragically enough, I think it's almost popular today that the higher you up somewhere in the leadership, the less integrity there is in life. That's a tragic reality of what is happening today. I would like us now to go to Zdravko. He is the professor of Christian ethics, of ethical studies at Loma Linda University in California. And you are also the author of the book, The Silent Church. You are a theologian. We are very much looking forward to hear your perspective on the discussion we are having right now. Zdravko, please.
Thank you, Tihomir. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to meet and listen to this illustrious panel of speakers who are walking the walk while some of us academics are talking the talk. It has been truly a pleasure to listen to every one of you, and the peril of coming last is that there is nothing else to say. Some of you have prepared such wonderful, comprehensive essay-like perspectives, and I've just put some bullet points down that I want to share and address, and maybe, unfortunately, repeat a number of things that have been already said. You know, they've taken some of my biblical texts from me already away, and some other ideas. So let me just put it a little bit into a historic context. So that's my first point, historic context. And that has several layers. Firstly, my historic context is that I'm very international, born in Croatia, marrying a Serbian as a Croat, moving to England, naturalizing there, working in pastoral ministry for 11 years, studying there my BA, MA, and PhD at King's College eventually in human rights and social justice, and then publishing the book on human rights, on role and rights to women and to poor and to the race relations issues that I've considered in different chapters of that book, The Silent Church, and then since then in many, many articles and other books in which I published those issues. So that's my general context. I'm an educator. I was a pastor, and I'm still ordained clergy and pastoring, preaching, but mostly what I do professionally nowadays is teach. I was chair of religion department on the East Coast in Maryland at Columbia Union College for 16 years. And then about 6-7 years ago, I moved to California, where I teach mostly ethics and religion, particularly bioethics, because I work within the context of medical university. University has a variety of healthcare sciences, 8 schools of healthcare sciences. And so that creates for me a new context. Some of you are advocating, some of you are artists and fighting on the edge of art to express yourself. Some are in politics. I predominantly try to influence people. And why I said all of this is for different reasons. Firstly, my audiences are usually students or former students. So I've trained a lot of ministers who are now pastoring large churches all around the world, Australia, America, England, etc. I have an audience of colleagues whom I studied with and also worked with in pastoral ministry in England, in UK in general, and in Europe, in some of the parts of the Europe that are beyond that. Recently, I was in Norway 2 years ago doing a whole 2 weeks of meetings with pastors and lay people, talking to them. And so my influence has been in trying to educate people to be more aware of the needs of the other, the widow, the orphan, the alien, the underdog, the marginalized, those who have no voice. And we need to raise voice on their behalf, as it was mentioned from Proverbs 31 and verse 9. And so as I look at social media myself and truth-telling, I'm fighting, or I am influencing continually those people, students, former colleagues, but also relatives. And when you start talking about truth-telling, and when your own relatives from around the world have very different viewpoints and opinions, gets even more complicated than when you're just trying to persuade people beyond that kind of narrow influence. Recently, there have been fights on social media among our own family members because of the perspectives and the truth as people see it, or lack of truth as they see it. So I'm saying social media becomes this platform that is many things. I want people to see that I'm baking sourdough starter bread, as well as advocating for social justice. And how do you do that one after another in the posts? It's a very confusing and very difficult thing at times, because it's not monolithic, it's not homogenic, it's a very, very complex polyphony of perspectives, voices, and issues that we are constantly expressing. So that's my struggle and my continual confusion on how to best do that. So that's personal disclaimer and personal history. But then we also need to have historical context of the issues that we are facing. National or world movements, signs of the new raises in fascism and extremism. And then we need to look back at the history, as I again, in my book, I addressed, and in consequent chapters and articles, issues of Nazism that is so close to many of us, because some of us, I'm of a German descent, and so the issues of Nazism have been present and studied in a kind of post-Holocaust ways, but I think that they need to be resurrected lest we forget, because it seems that some of these sentiments continue coming up not only in America, but in Europe in a very, very uncomfortable, ways. And so knowing history, historical context, what we believed we were fighting against in the sense of a Christ-centered life should be re-examined, rethought, and a lot to learn, and some of the things to unlearn. So that's my first point, historical context. And then even going back beyond the history of recent times, look at the biblical history. In what sense have refugees, hatred for minorities, issues of the people who are marginalized been presented and represented through the prophetic voices in the Jewish scriptures, in the Old Testament, and in the prophetic voices of the New Testament, of Jesus as someone who is the primary example for us to know how to go about living our kingdom of God sentiment today. So, even people in the ancient times, in biblical times, were reluctant to refugees. But now we look people like babies jailed, internment camps that are happening. And being informed is a very important aspect of telling the truth. So historical context. Secondly, and it was mentioned before, critical thinking. Again, as an educator, I struggle when I see people with so little critical thinking posting or thinking in the way that their politics or the sources of what they are listening to is in some way informing them and not exercising the critical thinking. People with masters, I have colleagues and friends who studied with me, who are posting things that are beyond belief. And sometimes I'm just perplexed. How can that happen? Where is their critical thinking in the process of what they see and what they post? And maybe I need to think also about myself. Am I exercising critical thinking? Am I doing Socratic, Platonic, the unexamined life is not worth having and not living? And therefore, am I continuing to examine and think critically? Because you see, as the matrix, for those of you who you mentioned so much postmodernism and postmodernism and postmodernism and post-secularism that has been very heavily in Europe, and in America we haven't yet smelled the coffee how much it's actually penetrating our culture, and it is hugely. But it's that film, The Matrix, in which again the Platonic ignorance is a bliss came so powerfully to us. Ignorance is a bliss, but actually I don't want to choose that pill. It seems that a lot of people are choosing that pill and thinking that that's harmless, but ignorance is actually taking lives. When people are out of ignorance speaking, and this has been just recently again in articles in New York Times and Washington Post and LA Times and others explored here, The Observer, The Independent have had articles on this, on how some of the media that is giving us those ignorant kind of aspects are really resulting in more people dying from, for example, COVID-19 because of the ignorance, and the ignorance that is perpetrated through news, through media channels. And, the study, something that we should really look at very carefully at. So, at what cost do we allow ignorance to be a bliss? And at what cost should we fight for the truth telling that will disperse ignorance and hopefully save lives of people who are just, living in that kind of context of ignorance? Thirdly, truth-telling. We talked about truth, and it's important. That's the crux of the subject, so that's why it's in the middle. Firstly, we need to have truth findings, and that is difficult today. When we talk about Jesus equals truth, that is true. Jesus equals love as well. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, 60, 70 years ago, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And it seems to me that we need to be continually seeking who Jesus is in order to espouse to that kind of truth. Because we've domesticated Jesus. We've done it in Europe. And that's why Nietzsche was kind of, critical of that process. If you look at the kind of philosophical trajectory and the death of God movement in the 60s and whatnot, as Hermund said, you know, even today, that's kind of still very, very prevalent. What have we done with Jesus? If we have created Jesus in our own image, so he's some kind of gun-loving libertarian, maybe we need to re-examine who is Jesus Christ for us today in 2020. And that way we could maybe replicate more of a biblical Jesus. And that means that we try to shed that layers of the onion of what we've created onto Jesus with the church, with the tradition, and find the real Jesus of the narrative of the biblical texts, of the Gospels, etc. So search for real and not inauthentic or fake Jesus. I want to also mention another point, and that is nationalism. Issue of nationalism is huge in Europe and in America. In America, incredibly. It is a problem, and it has always been a problem of wars and disrespect of other human beings, when we have elevated nationalism to our first primary identifying mark. I am a Croatian. I'm also British because I have pledged the allegiance to the Queen and her government and am a British citizen, Hedda. I'm also 20 plus years in America and have assimilated and accumulated and also pushed back to that culture. I'm also male. I'm white. Are those identifying marks primarily for me, or is my belonging to the kingdom of God my first and foremost identifying mark? And that changes everything. If I am a Croatian, if I am white, male, British, American, whatever, first, that means that that will color everything else that I have to say or seek or understand or even argue with. But if indeed my first allegiance is to the kingdom of God, then all of these other things are something that are given to me, or I have chosen them, but they're only part and parcel of that larger reality of me being a member of the kingdom of God, and therefore member of Jesus's movement. And that identity will shape how, and not only what, I will say in the truth telling. So finally, the last point, heroes. Who are my heroes and why? You know, we need to be virtuous people. But what is virtuous or good life in 2020? It is replicating the traditions that I espouse, that I love, that I appreciate. And, you know, I'm looking at statues going down and, you know, people having different heroes here and there. And then that is making me ask, who are my heroes and why? And how can I be more like my heroes? And here is one of them. How can I live with integrity? How can I live the radical Christian life? Not domesticated Jesus following, but radical Jesus following. How can I have courage? And that's very often the primary virtue that I'm seeking, because I see that I'm too many times very timid and too lacking in courage to speak truth to people that I know, not to the powers. To powers I can speak easily because they're outside, but people whom I loved and respected and still love in a Christian sense, but whom I vehemently disagree with and whom I cannot believe are saying what they're saying. How do I go at that with them? And here's how I will do it. I'm finishing with a quote, like a number of you did, of one of my heroes. I mentioned him already, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's not the only one, but I'm focusing again and again now in the last 3 to 6 months on reading back Dietrich. And I found through a friend a very important quote from his letter to his brother. He wrote to Karl Friedrich Bonhoeffer in 1935. Remember, 1935, way before the Second World War. The following: The brother was concerned about the younger brother, Dietrich, being too radical in the confessing church and the negative exposure it was giving him. And so this is what Dietrich wrote. Perhaps I seem to you rather fanatical and mad about a number of things. I myself am sometimes afraid of that. But I know that the day I become more reasonable, to be honest, I should have to chuck my entire theology. When I first started in theology, my idea of it was quite different, rather more academic probably. Now it has turned into something else altogether. But I do believe that at last I'm on the right track for the first time in my life. I often feel quite happy about it. I only worry about being so afraid of what other people will think as to get bogged down instead of going forward. I think I'm right in saying that I would only achieve truer inner clarity and honesty by really starting to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously. Here alone lies the force that can blow all this hocus pocus, in brackets, of Nazism, sky high, like fireworks, leaving only a few burnt out shells behind. These things do exist that are worth standing up for without compromise. To me, it seems that peace and social justice are such things, as is Christ himself. I end on Bonhoeffer's quote. I hope I can replicate it. I can get courageous to speak truth, not only to the powers, but also to the friends, to former students, to colleagues in ministry, to churches around me, etc.
Thank you, friends. You have truly given us much to think about, and no doubt there are many questions and comments you, our viewing friends, would like to ask and share with us. Let us remember the objective of this conversation. And the objective was and still remains to open up an opportunity for a continuing conversation on the relevant theme of how to speak the truth to power and to each other in our post-truth era from a Christian perspective. Our panelists are ready to face your questions and comments and respond to them in one of our future face-to-face conversations very soon. You are more than welcome to email us your questions. Our email address is provided on the screen. Also, you may share your questions and comments on the social media platforms that are making this conversation available to you. So, let us hear from you soon. Again, thank you, panelists, for providing us with so much food for thought and motivation for a proper action. I'm Tihomir Kukolja, the producer and the editor of the Face-to-Face Conversation. Blessings to you all, and see you very soon.